Jesus should have been a nobody from nowhere. And for a long time, he was. Mary was certainly a nobody. Joseph gets credit for being of the house of David, but he's not actually Jesus' father, is he? And they are from Nazareth, which was nowhere. It was a nowhere of a place. The Hebrew Bible doesn't record anything about Nazareth. The Talmud, the Midrash, don't make any mention of Nazareth. In fact, Nazareth seems to have been a byword for a fairly disrespected place, because when Philip finds Jesus, or maybe Jesus finds Philip, he rushes to his friend Nathanael and says, "You are not going to believe it. I have found the Messiah, and his name is Jesus of Nazareth." And, we underestimate how often sarcasm and irony show up in the Bible, because Nathanael says, "Can anything good come out of Nazareth?" The city of Nazareth is located in some rolling hills about 15 miles west of the Galilee, so a couple of good days' walk from Galilee. Today, the city of Nazareth has nearly 100,000 residents, and it's become a byword for a successful, it's called the Silicon Valley of Israel, the Arab Silicon Valley of Israel. And it's famous for its technological corporations, and the city is 70% Muslim and 30% Christian. But when Jesus was a boy, Nazareth would have been incredibly small. Maybe 100 people, maybe 400, maybe 75 to 100 families. However, even though Nazareth was a backwater, and it was small because it only had a well, so that limited how many people could live there, how many people could be sustained by a single well, it stood in the shadow of a much larger city. And I mean literally in the shadow of a much larger city. About 3.5 miles away was a very famous city that was being built by Herod called Sepphoris. And the interesting thing about Sepphoris is we not only hear about it in the ancient manuscript sources where it's called the Jewel of Galilee, but we have excavated, well, not we, I didn't have any part of this, but scholars have excavated a whole bunch of Sepphoris. It had public buildings, huge monumental public buildings, paved streets, count them, 2 covered markets. Nobody needed a covered market unless there were tens of thousands of people. Multiple bathhouses for Jewish rituals, and a theater. A theater usually means there are at least 25,000 people in a town. None of that was common for any other Galilean town at the time. Sepphoris does what it's supposed to do. It conveys the opulence and power of the Roman Empire. And that's exactly what King Herod meant for it to do. He wanted to display his own power, and he wanted to cozy up to Rome so he could keep that power. And during Jesus' time, Herod was involved in a very big building project. Now, that's not just some interesting historical fact. That matters. Jesus' father was not a carpenter. The word in the Bible is called tekton, and it's a Greek term for what we would now call a tradesman or a tradesperson. He probably had stone carving skills. He had all kinds of what we would call rough carpentry skills. He was a tradesman. Where do tradesmen go? They go where the building projects are. And 3.5 miles is only about an hour's walk, an hour or more walk. So we have no evidence of any of this, but it is entirely likely that Joseph had work because of Sepphoris. And if that's the case, then it's not unreasonable to imagine that an 8 or 9 or 10-year-old Jesus also learned to work in Sepphoris. So, like the headwaters of the Mississippi that grows to be an enormous river in our country, Nazareth has grown into something not at all insignificant, even though it was insignificant in its time. Jesus, however, was not a nobody from nowhere. He was a somebody from nowhere. There are no barriers to the wonder of God's love and grace. So you can call Nazareth not very glorious, you can call it mundane, you can call it insignificant, but this is the nowheresville where the Word became flesh. It's where Jesus, the man, the teacher, the healer, the wise person, was raised. I want to just point out again the art, that we are using. This is from John August Swanson, and Sarah Sperling, who does all of our graphics, is crafting some of this. And today we have the Annunciation. The full version is on the left, but there's a little detail of the Annunciation. If you haven't looked up John August Swanson, he's a native Californian. I was introduced to his art in an art gallery in Old Town, San Diego. His studio, he's deceased now, but his studio and display and shop are in Pasadena now. So finding simplicity in a complex life is part of what we get to look at when we stop in Nazareth on our way to Bethlehem. Just consider the simplicity of a place like Nazareth. Life would have been slower than in Sephora. It would have been less busy. You probably didn't need a lot of money if you lived in Nazareth. You probably had chickens and goats and probably bartered. You maybe needed some money to buy grain and some other things. You know, I don't know if any of you have experienced this, but my friends are all retiring. I don't know why, but I guess because they can. And a number of them are moving to places that are smaller towns than the great conglomerate metropolis that is Los Angeles and Orange County, in no small part because they're hoping for a slower pace in life. And some people do that right in the middle of their strongest earning years. They just want to step out of the rat race and leave it to the rats. And maybe you know some of these people, but whether you were born into a family in ancient Nazareth or retired to the mountains of North Carolina, a simpler life isn't necessarily an easier life. A simpler life isn't necessarily an easier life. People in Nazareth didn't actually choose their simplicity. They didn't choose it. The town would have been small enough that it would have struggled. Life would have depended on the annual harvest, as it has for most of human history. People lived and died by this year's harvest. What those people did have in Nazareth, though, was each other. They had each other. In that sense, a small town can be a lot simpler than a city or a suburb. Either you get on with your neighbors in a small town and learn how to share and care and support one another and live in harmony, or the whole community suffers. In larger populations like where we live, we can isolate ourselves and only hang out with the people who look like us, talk like us, share our culture, vote like us, read the same books. We do that, and we do it more now than we did 50 years ago. We self-segregate. Then the very next thing that happens is we think we can do without getting along with our neighbors, at least some of them. But when we choose to simplify our life, even just a little, we find that our neighbors are part of us. They belong to us, we belong to them. We begin, when we have a simpler life, to have a sense of mutual responsibility and care that we don't have when we isolate ourselves and only hang around with people who are like us. We become more willing to depend on others. And we begin to see that people who don't think like us, look like us, talk like us, enjoy the same music as us, are in fact just like us in every way that's important. And then our differences become delights instead of deal breakers. Wouldn't it be beautiful if our differences could be delights instead of deal breakers? Pause for a moment, just now, and consider your life in these simple terms. When you think of this phrase, well, we have each other. We have each other. Who do you think of? Who do you think of? Someone's picture comes to mind. And who has you? There's someone or someone's out there who say, well, at least we have each other, and it's you. Your face that comes to mind. You know, Americans have created a social order where that kind of simplicity can add value to our life, because otherwise keeping relationships with our neighbors can be very difficult. We all need to find a Nazareth. We all need to find a Nazareth, a place where we can simplify, at least sometimes, where we can reduce distractions, at least once in a while, and be free to think and contemplate and listen, not necessarily to be alone, but to be where we're more connected to each other and not less. And here's why. We need a place in our life, whether it's every day or weekly or occasionally, more often is better, where we are open to the possibility that God can intrude and interrupt. We need enough space in our life, enough simplicity for breath between things, so that there is the possibility of interruption and intrusion, so God can break in and get our attention. One of the things about choosing Mary is in her simple life, she noticed God got her attention. Is there any place in your life like that? Do you have a Nazareth? Now, simplicity doesn't mean insignificant. Nazareth was small, it was somewhat secluded, it's not on any major road to anywhere, but that doesn't mean it was cut off from the world. 3.5 miles away is Sepphoris. Jesus grew up probably going back and forth to Sepphoris, at least some of the time. And in his childhood, we know that he went at least once and probably multiple times to Jerusalem for the high holidays. Scholars debate this, but most agree that he probably could read and write. He was certainly educated enough to debate the elders in the temple and in the synagogue, and to take on the Roman collaborators and the Roman authorities. You know, Jesus, if you look at his encounters, was too clever by half. He was the guy who was so clever that he won every debate. You know how people feel about that? Not that happy. It got him into trouble, although, according to the gospel, it really pleased the powerless and the poor. Here's the point, and it's a simple one. Nazareth was a place where God showed up. Nazareth, your Nazareth, is the place where God shows up. If you've lived a life where sometimes you feel you're in a place where no good can come, no good can come from this place where I am. Or maybe others have told you no good comes from people like you, people who grew up in your neighborhood, people who look like you. Nothing good comes from people like you. If you believe that the place where you are from, or the place where you are in right now, is insignificant, if you believe that you don't matter, if you feel overlooked and undervalued, then goodness begins to fade from your life, doesn't it? And in the value system of the world, in the economy of power and wealth, in the push and shove, you may imagine that you don't matter. But in God's economy, in the economy of Jesus, there is no place you are where God can't show up. There is no place where you are that God can't show up. The incarnation means the Word became flesh here. God with us right now. And that makes Nazareth a very important stop on the journey to Bethlehem. Nazareth teaches us that the place where we are may feel empty and significant, far removed from the place we thought our life would take it, but it is a place still full of God's presence. And we find that because of, not in spite of, simplicity. So this morning, I invite you to the joy of the simple things in your life: lunch with a friend, the park with a kid. What joy will you glean in this season from the simplest of moments? How will you set aside the push and shove, the greed and speed of today's life, and rediscover the simple gifts that are around you? Today, I invite you to savor not just this season, but savor all of life's seasons, every one of them pregnant with possibility. I'm glad you're here with me today, because for me, you are a gift.